How do you make comics without all the frustration, without feeling lousy and inadequate all the time? Join me, Jess Rolifson,
And me, Tom Hart.
on the Terrible Anvil. Each week, we build community and shift our mindset about what it means to make comics and art. We're working through the whole process, one piece at a time, turning our suffering and angst into fun and glee. Join us at sawcomics.org. It's the Terrible Anvil. I'm your host, Jess Rolifson, and I'm here with my electric co-host.
Tom Hart, the electric co-host.
I'm in a study room, a library study room, and I was looking for an adjective, and it didn't really have any, but it was talking about an electrical outlet. I was like, boom,
Boom.
boom, we got one. So this week, on this week's episode, we're talking about color, particularly how to color in comics. And this feels like a sneaky sequel to last week's episode about what medium you might want to work with if you're working in comics and you like different types of materials. Similar to that, we're coming at you digitally, virtually, in the past, present, or future from the Sequential Artist Workshop. I might have mentioned that, learn.sawcomics.org. And we're streaming via our YouTube channel. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see how amazing Tom and I look today. And if you're not, just take our word for it if you're listening via other outlets. Yeah, and I mean, I have some subtopics, but we don't need to. I don't really need to talk about them in advance.
Well, I always like to start with some big picture, usually, provocations or even statements. But I just have a big question. I just have a big issue question, which is like, why is color separate? Why is it a separate topic? What does it mean?
Yeah, what does color mean?
Yeah,
Like, what is a comic anyway?
yeah. Well,
What are we doing here on this earth? These are all good questions. And that's a good question. I don't know. It depends on what era of comics you're looking at, but it seems like a lot of the golden age stuff had color. It wasn't like comics were always black and white or they have to be, but I do think some of the process, if you might not have known from any of the previous episodes, comics are a labor-intensive process. So maybe we compartmentalize color because we're like, oh my God, another thing I have to do. I already scripted it, and now I have to draw it, and then you're like, oh, that's another thing. So it's sort of like maybe your philosophy on lettering or backgrounds is just like one more freaking thing. But hopefully you can find a place to rejoice and frolic within that long-suffering cartoonist vibe. I don't know why it's separate. It might sometimes it's budgetary. uh, we don't have the budget to print in color, but now you can share in color online for basically free. You can print your own stuff. It's way less cost prohibitive to do color now more than ever, one would argue. Um, so the only thing I know that I don't know that I know the internet will be a better resource for you is like the technical stuff, like CMYK versus RGB and color profiles and balancing your monitor for color. We're not going to talk about that, but these things
not at
exist.
all.
Tom and I are like, no, 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 no. But yeah, I find that when I talk to other cartoonists, we usually talk about what color is it supposed to be, or how do I make a palette, or where do I start with color? Even if you're someone like me who enjoys a bit of color, or you might feel a little more relaxed. Sometimes you're like, where do I start? So I have some hot tips for you on that.
I want to keep going a
You
little
need
bit
room
on
temperature tips.
room temperature tips.
Just regular pointers if you want
Warmish
them. Yeah,
tips.
like nice to hold in your hand, like a mug. It's not too hot. You can drink it. It's good.
Um, I guess it's worth mentioning that in the tradition of comics, right? You can tell me what details I got wrong, but in the sort of tradition of most of printing, I think globally, is that line, harsh lines, strong lines, very visible lines have become dominant, right, for a long period of time because that was easy to print, right?
Easy to read as well.
Right, right. So lines became very, again, very dominant. color became something that if you could add it, it was a good thing. You know, it was added to your lines. Some comics were color, some weren't, et cetera, et cetera. But we have reached this point where they're kind of the same. Like lines are even like the kind of the weird thing sometimes where people will just they just make an art thing, make a picture, and there's maybe more color fields than there are lines, which is totally different for at least somebody who grew up when I did, which is very much in the black and white world because it was cheaper because of the technology and stuff. So that might be one reason that color is often thought of as a separate thing. Um, it's just that for so long it was a separate thing, right? To add color was it was a, you know, you needed different expertise to get it printed well. You know, uh, a good printer would take your engravings or whatever and print your line work pretty well. I mean, I'm talking 19th century or even before, but to get something printed in color, I don't know, lithography or the kind of wood cuts that they do in Japan or something like that. That's a way more complicated process. So anyway, they were often separate once printing became a thing. Anyway, now I don't know any. Now I have nothing else to say. So
I know.
now,
I feel like we could like totally get like a printmaking historian on here and tell us like, well,
hmm,
this is exactly what happened. I have a marginal amount of knowledge about how printing processes influence how we digest books and art. So
hmm.
broadly, art was commissioned by very wealthy people or the church or someone with a lot of money would be like, hey, you there, make this thing. And we weren't really interested in making a lot of a thing for everyone to have access to. It's like one beautiful artist book that the king has, or one beautiful Sistine Chapel ceiling. Like they just want one of everything, and it's beautiful, like a museum object, which is very cool. But when the printing press started to get its legs and it became relatively more affordable to make something in a series or a batch. I keep thinking of cookies.
Cookies, I
Every
know.
episode, I'm like, let's have a baking analogy. I'm not even that good of a baker. I'm very mediocre. But anyway, um, yeah, it's sort of influenced like who had the access to it, who could pay for it. Maybe more lay people could afford, like you could be your own printmaker and make a living reproducing art, and then maybe middle class people would hang that artwork on their wall, and then it became really affordable to kind of make your own stuff. So and make copies of it. And then color, I'm thinking of Audubon's Birds of America, or heck yeah, I don't even know if that's a correct title, but he did a series of drawings that became, um, I think there were etchings. Some printmaker out there is like pulling their hair out. They're like, oh my gosh. But they had colorists, watercolor artists that would sit around a table. A lot of them were women. A lot of them were unpaid or uncredited, and someone would have the orange, and someone would have the yellow, and someone would have the.
Wow.
So it was like they had a bunch of colorists so they could get these artist books printed in a series, sort of like an early version of Kickstarter or something. You would give Audubon money, he would go to the Americas and draw birds, and then he would come back and give you a volume of a folio of work that he had made, and you would wait with bated breath for the next installment of Audubon's bird book. But it became like several hundred drawings, and it's a giant, giant folio that I don't know, probably 200 or 300 drawings. Um, but I thought that was interesting that the color was often given to the ladies, like quilting around a table. It was the same thing with illuminated manuscripts. They're like, you're not doing anything in there, you crusty old nuns and monks. Here, why don't you paint this thing? Um, and but those they were just like one copy. But so yeah, so how do we get here to comics in the century we're in, not being cloistered? Well, I guess you do have a kind of some cartoonists are cloistered. I I like to get out of the house. Um,
It's a nun analogy as well. Um, okay, now comics in the real world, comics in the current world. You,
how do we get here?
I
Okay,
don't,
so other things happen. Paraphrase, and here we are today.
well, I've got some topics, but they're not like I literally have nothing to say on them. I sort of I do think of you as an expert in color because um, you've taught it in a myriad of ways. Let me backtrack by saying I'm interested in flat color versus painted color. I'm interested in textured color. I'm interested in color that exists without line. Um, I'm interested in various forms of paint and other ways of applying color. So those are things I'd like to discuss. But I really and also like actually at the top, the idea of a color palette makes me nauseous. It means like I have to keep track of something and very bad at keeping track of things. Um, but I know that's something that you're really rigorous about too. So I want to hear what I'm desperate to hear you talk.
All right, Tom needs help, everybody, and normally I'm the person that's asking Tom for help. So here's my moment to shine. Um, okay, I have a couple of hot takes or room temperature
Warm
takes.
takes.
Okay,
Yeah.
warm takes from Saul. Um, if you're there's a couple of different ways you can approach color as a newbie or someone who gets nauseous with color. One of those things is just using one color as a spot color, like do, kind of using like a shadow if you're thinking more about light and dark. You could also just you print if you're interested in printing, print your work on colored cardstock, and then you're like, "Ooh, this is fancy," and it's just printed in black and white. But the paper itself is a color, and that can be really lovely. Um, if you're in doubt about color, the one thing you can think about is contrast. My lukewarm take is that if something is the right quote unquote value, like if it's got enough contrast, it doesn't really matter what color it is. And if my
Right.
painting teacher from my freshman year of college is listening, pretend just black out and pretend I didn't say that because he'll be really sad. But it's true. If you're trying to learn color on a budget, I think like Tom said, early printing processes and printing processes today have it in common that we want to be able to see what it is we've drawn so someone can read the images and the words and things like that. So if you've got a bunch of color that's really muddy or dark, no one's going to be able to see what's going on. So um, make something a little bit lighter than you think you need to. That's another tip you could try. The other thing, my really cool tip that I've been using, because even though I love color, I get lost too at the beginning of a project. I have been taking this old beat up free copy of Tintin by Hergé and just stealing his color palette. It's really good. I promise you. If you like Google images of Tintin, take it into Photoshop or whatever and just use the color dropper tool and make your own palette. You're gonna be home free. Hergé already figured out color, and he was working with watercolor, so it has this transparency. It's never too dark.
Huh.
It's 10 out of 10.
Who
His
was
grades
coloring
are
that?
great.
That was
Oh, I think he
watercolor.
colored it himself. It's in watercolor and ink.
Colored it himself. So how do
I
you color?
believe.
How do you color 48 pages where Tintin's jacket and Tintin's skin tone and everything has to be the exact same color? Because it never changes. It's not like there's anything very
Well,
expressionistic in a Hergé comic.
right. I guess it's there's some you can kind of mix like a lot of people do this in any sort of in comics and painting. You get the right color, you're like, hell yeah. And then you just go like a bumblebee through the clover and you just okay, that's a Tintin sweater blue, Tintin sweater blue, Tintin sweater blue. Every time I see Tintin and he's wearing a sweater, I gotta make that blue go there. And then you run out of that awesome color and you're like, oh, fiddlesticks, I have to mix
Right.
this again. It might be
That's
slightly different. I tend to think that no one's gonna really notice if you're in the ballpark, and like I said, it's not too dark or too light, or if we know that it's blue, it's not varying too green. But I think there's a little bit of wiggle room. But he knew what he was doing and that he probably mixed a lot for himself, and he probably painted them all at the same time, so he was more likely to get color continuity if that's important for you. And continuity sometimes is important in comics. It can be really helpful if your characters are all kind of wearing a uniform. And Tintin is known, like a lot, you could dress up for Halloween as Tintin because he has an outfit.
yeah.
Um, but
He had
if
a
you're
studio
not,
too. I
it,
doubt.
go
I
ahead.
suspect other people might have been coloring it, right? He had a studio of assistants,
I mean, it's totally possible. Yeah, and maybe they were all sitting around in a circle and they're like, "Oh, I'm the blue guy. I just make a lot of blue." So
right?
if you can hire like 5 unpaid interns to color your stuff, that's also a great way to get it done. But if you can't, I mean, I'm working digitally on this comic, and I stole the colors, and they're like blues, really fabulous greens, a little bit of yellow, and I'm like, oh, he's got a really good pink. I think there's like a reddish color. I didn't steal all the colors, but it's pretty full palette. So when I make a palette, digitally anyway, I'll make blobs on like a JPEG of different colors, and I won't use all of them. but I'll use, like, probably, like, a half of them or something, or a third. I try to do less, but what Tom's saying about Tintin's blue sweater, um, that might be what I would describe as an anchor of color. If you know Tintin has to have that blue sweater, similar to when I do the hospital comics, I know my partner needs blue scrubs, and so do all of his coworkers. I'll make sure that's a color in my color palette. I gotta have that seal blue for the hospital scrubs. And then I can do whatever else I want. I'm like, well, there's the inside of the hospital room and then there's a hallway. Could those be different colors so that I don't have to work as hard to make the backgrounds awesome, for example. So sometimes I also really love talking to people when they're in the nascent stages of a piece and it's like almost off the rails and they're like, don't worry, when I put color on it, it's gonna make more sense.
Right.
And I'm like, if your cookie is undercooked and you put icing on it, is it still good? I don't know. More baking analogies.
Um, I want to ask about the anchor color. You talked about your partner's scrubs in the hospital comic. When you're choosing that anchor color, are you choosing it to some degree based on value as well? Are you making it dark, for instance, expecting to make the rest of the comic in light tones, or vice versa, or anything like that?
Well, sometimes I'll think about the time of day or the vibe, as the kids say, but I'll try to, I know in comics, I know less about this, but some people will do flat color and then pass it along to a colorist where it's like, this is kind of the vibe I'm going for, but make it better.
Mhm.
So I kind of think about color that way where I've got the anchor color of the blue, and then if I want to go darker later, I might add a separate layer with shadows because that's easier to think about. Another step to think about, but it's easier not to think about contrasts. I can kind of approximate the right colors digitally, and then I'm like, ooh, you know what? This could be moodier. What if I have a separate layer that just makes the whole thing a lot darker? That's easier than trying to tinker with each individual color. That's how I've been working lately. But some of the best results I've gotten when I worked on the graphic novel, it was only 2 colors per chapter, and then I would change the opacity, and sometimes, let's say it's blue and orange. Sometimes one page would be really orange with a little bit of blue or no blue at all, and some pages would be really blue with vice versa, right? I'm getting confused. So that could be a way to, like, maybe, like, emotionally charge what you're trying to say or, like, back up what's happening on the page by kind of being more psychological with the color, and that's easier to do if you're not, "All my trees are green and all my skies are blue." That's cool too, but, you don't necessarily have to do that all the time. It can just be a value thing.
Okay, so I have a couple more questions. Two which are very related. One is that this podcast called The Terrible Anvil. It's all about hitting deadlines, right? So when you chose, for instance, blue and orange for your graphic novel, which are contrasting colors, right? For those of you who know the
And a
color.
little complimentary.
Well, I mean, isn't that complementary does mean they're opposites on the color wheel, right? So they're
Yeah.
um which has always been strange phrasing to me, but whatever. I'm definitely like a loser in the color system, so I don't.
All the, color theorists and art historians out there are, like, just they've turned off their radios.
I know definitely.
They've
But
left long ago.
so was that a choice about time? And also then the second question I'd like to ask, which is related, is have you ever, because of a deadline, made some crazy color choices that worked well? Because I know you've described, I hand in these
I've
crappy thumbnails and they love them. So then I just build on that. Like, you know,
I feel like I've had the opposite happen where I made my choices and then I was like, "Oh, that didn't go as well as I wanted." So at the outset of the graphic novel, I picked 4 colors total. There was like a sand color, a brown because I thought that would be useful, and there were skin tones. So I was like, maybe, and it was a dark brown. So I was like, maybe this could add shade, shadow, but also like get a more variety of skin tones. And then I had the blue and that kind of orangey red. The chapters that were blue and red were pretty good. The chapters that were, like, sandy ochre and this, like, orangey red were fantastic. They were great.
mm,
Um, the yellow and blue chapters, I don't think were very good at all. So, oh, and there was another combo. I don't think I did yellow and brown. There was one other combo. It just wasn't very good. So, there are different opportunities at every combination, and I don't know. I think, I don't know what I could have done differently. I would probably limit it even more, maybe just 3 colors. 3 primary colors, you're kinda good to go if you use 3 primary colors and kinda layer them because on the one hand, it ties a hand behind your back where you're like, "Oh, I only have 3 colors." But on the other hand, if you have those 3 primary colors, one would argue you have access to all the other secondary and tertiary colors, so
that causes more problems if you have too much. If
Mo
that's
colors, mo problems.
yeah, that's one reason I stay away from it. It's because I have to actually
Ah!
make
Well,
some
again,
choices. I can't.
anytime we get lost, think about contrast. Just be like, can you tell what the hell's going on in this panel? And what's the vibe? Is it nighttime? Okay, let's make it dark blue. Oh, it's too dark. I can't see what's going on here. Let me make it a little bit lighter. That's fine. Oh, there's this kind of magic object here. I think it should be a different color. Or maybe I only want to use blue. I'm going to erase everything and just make that magic object white. So it's just different level of contrast. And our eye goes there. Make it easy for yourself, Tom.
Oh my gosh. I mean, no. Um, let's talk about. Wait, did you answer both questions? I think
Oh,
so.
I
Yeah,
don't know. Were there
that's
two?
fine. Just if you made colors.
Oh, if anything went awesome? Oh, I don't know. I mean, a lot of the palettes that seem to go better. If I go lighter and brighter, they tend to print better and they tend to just look better in the end.
Lighter and
Um,
brighter. I worry
ju-
that just makes it sound like I worry that lighter and brighter says just use candy colors and you're good to go. That's make everything look like a jelly bean, which is what
Right. I don't know. Well,
no,
and the other thing too is
what
when
I
we
would
think
do.
about contrast, there's white and black are colors too, if one would argue. So you have the black of your delicious lines and you have the white of the page, let's say, or the white of the monitor. So how do you make those colors more awesome? If you use a lot of ink, your color's going to look better. And white can help you out too. Even just like the caption boxes or word balloons, that white with the color, you're like, oh, this actually doesn't look that bad. If you have a like, then you have three. It's like building a song where you have this note and this note and this sound, and then you're like, oh, there's a little bit of a space here where there wasn't one.
Okay, so you don't need a whole orchestra, you just need a couple
Yeah, I think starting small
like
ends up. And then you can always go back to the crayon box if you're like, man, I really need a pink here. Or this flesh tone's not going to work if I'm only using blues, for example. I don't know if it's important. But with contrast also, you don't want all of your colors to be the same value or tone. And what I mean by that is like if you have a digital process, you take your color into, let's say, Photoshop or Procreate and translate that into a black and white file. If all the tones look like the same shade of gray, that means that all of your colors are a little similar. So you want like a dark color, a light color, and a medium color, and then black and white. And then you kind of have like all the crayons in the box represented at the UN of your color palette.
can I can talk about the image behind me right now. If you're on YouTube or Zoom, you can see it, but if you're not, I'll describe it. It's a UPA cartoon UPA still from the 1950s, possibly early 60s, but probably 50s. And it's only pretty much three values, right? It's a bunch of people in cars, period. They're all facing us. The whites of the headlights are bright white, and that is the brightest thing in the picture. And then the people themselves are a light to middle tone, and then the cars are dark tone, mostly. And that's pretty much it, right? We're mostly, if you're talking about value, we're mostly looking at three values, maybe four. And it's working really well, right? Or is it? Did I pick a bad picture?
I think it is. Yeah, the contrast is really good. That's working really well because the very background is black, and then the background
The
behind the
background,
heads
black.
inside the cars is also black. And I guess it seems to be the power of that image is there's a lot of cars on the road and there's every different type of person in their car. So the emphasis might be on the variety of facial shapes and expressions and the myriad experiences of traffic. So that makes sense that they would keep the contrast. Like all the lightest values are on the faces.
So that brings me to, again, like when we color a comic, quote, color a comic, um, we're not trying to recreate reality, right? We're trying to make it a part of the storytelling, or at least part of the reading experience.
Yeah. And some of these, I mean, look at the color in Watchmen or some of the stuff from the 80s. Like the color in some of these comics are like totally off the rails. So maybe you don't love Hergé and you're like, his color's not that exciting to me. Go to any of your favorite comic books ever. Jillian Tamaki did this one summer with just purple, all different types of indigo and purple, really a limited palette. I think Camille Jordi just did a book. Man, I can't remember the name of it. Oh, my brain. Anyway, watercolor, amazing. Basically, it looks like a full palette. Looks like a lot of work, but you could steal if you're like, I don't have that kind of time. You could steal one panel from a really elaborate color palette too. Like one panel of Watchmen is as good as the whole thing. And I don't know, they put like magenta and lime green, all kinds of crazy stuff together. and it almost doesn't work. In my opinion, I'm like, "Wow, that's crazy," but yeah, it just depends on what you're going for. I think, like you said last week in Medium, um, it's not like Vanessa Davis said something like, "Comics is the most optional medium ever." I think colors you don't have to use it if you don't want to. What about color, if anything, speaks to you or is exciting to you? Maybe you're having a pink era and you're like, "Everything just needs to be pink."
Pink era.
Michael Cho's Shoplifter is all pink, and it's kind of the best thing ever. It's so good. It's a wonderful graphic novel. And it's black, white, and pink. Boom. And
Who's
only one
shoplifting?
shade of pink. One shade of pink. It's like a juicy magenta. It's so good. Like a totally great. So yeah, start with one color, then graduate to two, three if you're feeling crazy, four if you're really, really wild. Or get a lot of colors, but say I'm only gonna use a couple of these.
I want to go back to that because I know you teach that one color, two color, three color method. So I want to come back to that in a bit, but I want to quickly related to what you were just describing, remind us of like Golden Age comics, mainstream American comics, Silver Age comics, and even after the Silver Age a little bit, they would, because A, they were working on a deadline, and B, they were working for cheap printing, they would do crazy things. If you go back, especially Silver Age, if you go back and look at things, they make choices that I can't believe they made. Where like, you know, Peter Parker is in the foreground and two people are talking in the background, and Peter Parker is completely green, like his skin, his hair, his clothes, everything, and it acts to sort of push him.
Spotlight. Yeah.
Well, no, it actually pushes him out of the spotlight a little, and you watch
Mm,
the characters in the back, right? You can work
mm,
both. Depends again on value
mhm.
contrast. And so if you just look for that thing, like which is kind of a color silhouette, if you just look for that, open up any Silver Age comic or later, you see it all the time, and you're like, wow, that magenta is crazy. I can't believe they painted that character magenta from head to toe. And it's not, it's just one panel or a whole crowd. A whole crowd is green, kind of like the anyway, I just love looking at that stuff. And to me, that's so
Yeah.
wild. My literal brain thinks
Yeah.
trees are brown and green and leaves are green. And it always takes a very literal approach to color. And all I need to do is either look to decades before for inspiration or just work on a deadline and just do some crazy thing.
Yeah. Tom, didn't you do it where you had like a coloring book and you forced yourself to color it in an hour and you you were
Mhm.
using your daughter's markers and they were in varying states of dried outness and you were like, I ran out of yellow here, so I add brown and he posted the results and basically did like a blog post, I think somewhere on Saw, and it's so wonderful because I don't know, it has this manic energy, but also its own sensibility where you're like, well, obviously I could only use pink here because the green had dried out long ago and then red would be too strong. So it was really cool. It felt like I was walking through a curated museum show with you and you're like, this is behind the scenes. This is how it got made. Um
Yeah, thanks for
yeah.
noticing. That's also in the inner critic recovery program course that I have, and it was the last hour of 2020. I decided to take, I think, a 48 page coloring book and finish the whole thing in that hour because 2020 was such a lousy year. I was like, I got to get out of this year somehow. So, and I think they were crayons. I don't think they were markers, but anyway, and it was really fun to make choices on the fly, and they're not consistent. Like I started out early and I was like, oh, I really got this going. And then I realized like, oh my God, I took a minute and a half for that page. I I I don't have a minute and a half for every page. And so I had to get faster and faster. And by the end, I think I chose like three colors max, and I'm just scribbling, 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 scribbling. It was so much fun and so liberating. And that taught me more about color. Not that I know much about color anyway, but that taught me more about color than anything.
Yeah.
And thanks for the reminder, because I think maybe I should I should make a comment that way. Again, those deadlines, they're so helpful. God, because they
I
just
really
take
do.
they take so much pressure off. You don't, when the final judgment comes and God says, how was your artwork? And you say, I don't know, I just did it really fast. And then they'll say pass, they'll say keep,
Yeah.
rather than you had all the time in the world and you made such crap. But no, I say I was under a crazy deadline. They'll like let you go.
That's
Sorry,
funny.
go ahead.
No, that's so good. I was last week I was traveling. I had gone to my sister's house and I went through all of my earthly possessions I left at her house about 8 years ago, 7 years ago. She says it's 8, I think it's 7. Anyway, she's like, and then it kept getting longer when we were telling people, why is Jess in town? And it's like, oh, she's left her stuff in my house for a decade. I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Anyway, it was a decent amount of stuff. And I went through the easy stuff first, like all the clothes don't fit me anymore. So that was easy. And then the books, I needled through them and got about half of them away. Then I had 3 bins of artwork that, probably a couple decades of drawings. And it was really what's been very funny is like in high school, I thought it would be really awesome to work really big, like all of these really cool artists that I
Mhm.
saw in museums. I was like, I want to work really big on giant pieces of discarded plywood. And uh and then I lived in New York for like 15 years and my work got smaller and smaller because I kept having to move. And I'm not a very strong person on a variety of levels, but definitely not physically. I'm not a specimen of any kind. So then I started working these 4 by 6 pieces of paper. It's about as small as I could work without losing my ability to see what I was doing. And that's how I got started doing these Prince portraits and also portraits of my friends and cartooning buddies. And they also became color studies, similar to what Tom was doing last week in the Saw plant monthly plant challenge, where everybody draws a different plant every day in the month of April. He was like, I don't know anything about Procreate. I don't know anything about color. I'm going to color flowers in Procreate because I have these parameters and I only have a day to draw these daffodils. Boom, done. And they're fabulous, really, really great. And I talk about them all the time because I think that's what I was doing with the Prince portraits. I am continuing to be obsessed with Prince, the recording artist, but also as like, I didn't do a pink one. Oh, and I know he likes purple. Like I did a lot of purple ones, and I was like, oh, what other? Ooh, and he always had really great outfits. So sometimes if it was a color image, I could be like, oh, this scarf is yellow. Maybe this whole thing is yellow. And I don't know, thinking about contrast, like he has amazing eyebrows. I don't, and amazing hair that's like textured, but also like very, I don't know, like very contrasty, right? So I was like, I was having such a great time just drawing these tiny Prince portraits over and over. But it was just a way to, oh, I haven't made a pink one. Oh, he hasn't had a blue one. Oh, his shirt's purple in this one, and the background could be yellow. You just start having a conversation with yourself about what obviously makes sense. It's very similar to the coloring book exercise in the inner critic recovery program that Tom did.
So maybe that's a good segue to how I've seen you sometimes teach color, which is you allow people one color plus white, correct? Right? And
Yeah.
that's okay, paint or whatever via whatever medium. It's like even that, like to me, that's kind of mind blowing. It's like, well, life isn't one color, life is a million colors. What do you mean one color plus white, right? But so explain that and explain how you build that up to a larger palette for people that you're
Mm.
seeing.
This is really good if you're new to a particular medium of color itself. So like gouache, I'll do it in the gouache class. We have like a just a standard color class. It's very similar to the watercolor class that we teach at SAW. It's structured the same way where you one color the first week, 2 colors, the second week, 3 colors, the third week, and every color you want, or 4 colors or more, the last week, if it's a 4 week class or something like that. But using one color, my hope is that you would think about contrast first, but also you figure out like, oh, this is how you mix this. Because a lot of people are like, gouache, it's like toothpaste. I don't know how thick or how thin it should be. So it can allow you to practice the material itself without getting too frustrated. And that could even hold true for digital mediums like Procreate if you're not very familiar. It's like, well, just do it monochromatic first and see how comfortable you are and see if you like this brush. And then you start getting kind of cocky and you're like, oh, I need more colors. And then it's just like less to think about. So thinking about the least amount of stuff and getting comfortable with the medium is good. But if you're already comfortable with the medium, then maybe you need 2 colors. But then you're like, well, if I pick this one color, that choice is going to influence the second color you choose. Like, oh, I don't know if I want 2 greens since my first choice was this green. Maybe I want a yellow, or maybe I want a red, or maybe I want something really different, like a purple. So how similar or different do you want that second choice? And that illustrates, unfortunately, it's a choose your own adventure where you're like every choice leads to another choice. And you're
Yes.
like, where did I go wrong?
Right.
But two, there's only so many mistakes you can make with two, right? And so let's say you made a quote unquote mistake with that second color choice, or maybe the first color choice. When you get to 3 colors, you sort of be a virtuoso by that point. You're like, no, 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 I'm not doing that 2 green thing again. I'm gonna do red and brown this time. I don't know. I don't know what you'll uncover, but you'll develop your own inner vocabulary of what to lean into or what seems to be working. And then eventually you'll do the things that work and you'll get bored. And then you'll just want to try something new and then you're off to the races. It's
Hmm.
easy as one, two, three.
Um, all right, I have some other questions. Uh, I told a student recently, I want to know if I did the right thing or if I did the wrong thing, you can tell me. They had a marvelous comic and like me has a cartoony um uh drawing style. And so sometimes I'll fill in the background with just a flat color.
Yeah.
And I the couple times I did forays into flat colors, I should mention like I thought I was doing great. I had fun. I still look at it and I think that looks pretty weird and good, but I remember I think it was I definitely had one or two friends say, "Oh, you should get somebody to color your comic next time." Anyways, anyway, but but it's hard to know how consistent to be, how much, or like, when I'm quote just filling in backgrounds of a color, should I play around? Should I keep going? Should I be experimental? Should I change it up?
Mm,
Or what? What am I trying to do with, that background color takes up a lot of space, takes up a lot of visual space in the panel.
yeah.
I don't know. How would you advise me
Well, if
if,
you're working page by page, like I feel like I ask myself this vague question at the beginning of like every time I thumbnail and well, maybe it's not so much in the thumbnails, but like penciling where I'm trying to improve the previous draft. What is going on this page that's different from the previous one? What could I do here that would be in service to what just happened or what might happen later? And maybe there's nothing. Maybe you're like, just keep it nice and and just get right through like you're shopping with a list at the grocery store and it's nothing fancy. That's great. But maybe there's a really big moment that you've been obsessed over, and it's like the whole thing about the story, and you want it to be 10% more special. You get to decide how to do that. It doesn't have to be like totally amazing, but you just knowing what you know about the story and the panels, you can approach each panel a little bit differently. So I look at the whole page. I'm like, which one of these panels is sad? Which one of these panels is outside? Is it inside? Is it what's it smell like in there? Like you could see if there's something available. And that's just where to start with, right? So that let's say panel 3, it's in a dusty old library. I'm like, okay, so maybe it's daytime outside. So I'm like, okay, I'll make it kind of dark, but not too dark because not the power's not out or whatever. And it's inside and it seems like a welcoming space. Maybe I'll do like some yellow ochre because I know it won't get too dark, but I could use it pretty saturated and it would look dark if I had a little bit of white or something and see how far I get. And just leave it for a second. Like don't totally finish it. But then look at the other panels. I'm like, all right, well, I chose that kind of boring yellowy brown. What can I do that's different in these other panels? Oh, the last panel, they finally leave the library and they go outside and they bump into a friend and they have a picnic. And it's a nice day outside, it turns out. But we didn't know that earlier in the page. And maybe there's a lot of lighter colors here, or I really want to play with the blue I stole from Hergé's Tintin sweater and put that blue there and see if that works. So I don't know. I mean, eventually you get to the end of the page and you're like, that seems fine. And if it's not, you might adjust the contrast if you're working with digital. If you're working with watercolor, a lot of people get really terrified. They're like, I can't take backsies, but you could theoretically scan it and adjust it in Photoshop. So it's never over. Some people will do several versions of the same panel on a separate piece of paper to decide if they can't decide and they don't want to quote unquote ruin it, they just experiment in the margins until they find something they like. If you completely screw it up, there will probably be another comic page right after that that you get to practice on again because comics take 1,000 years. They're way too long. So just like, don't worry about it. It's the same thing with inking. Like maybe the first couple of pages look really weird, and then you get in a groove. That might happen with a color too. It might be weird for a while, and then you'll figure it out. Kind of like 11:59 in 2020 at Tom's house. He was like, "I'm flying. I can just use purple and yellow."
Um, that's interesting because you bring up story a little bit. So, right, okay, everything happens in this dusty space, but then they go outside and they meet a friend, right? You said. So like that friend could be a really bright and sunny part of the story, right? That's a friend they've been hoping.
Maybe it's a friend you don't want to run into,
Oh,
and
I
then
was
it's
gonna go
like
there,
the
right? Do you
color.
change the color if it's like your evil energy vampire friend, right? Like, what would that be a choice you would make? Or is it
Maybe,
more
but
about how light it is, how dark it is outside and stuff?
it also depends on like how long a scene is. Like if you're changing scenes every panel and then you're changing the palette every panel, it might
Hmm.
start to feel really non sequitur, which is a vibe and could be really cool. But if you want there to feel like there's some type of continuity, maybe every time that character shows up, everything gets a little darker. Then that works better if you repeat it separately. Like there's not one shot. If it's a character or a situation where it seems like one shot and it's not super important, I try to keep it just low key and have it kind of blend with everything else. But if it's if it's remarkable anyway, you don't necessarily have to do anything super big, if at all. I mean, you could also color really literally. Like there's nothing wrong with that. I think people just get really burnt out doing that. But often, the more nonfiction-y my comics are, the more literal my color is because I'm like, oh, I gotta let me button this up here. Gotta keep you don't want to get too crazy. Oh my God, who wears their hoodie like that? Um, I don't know. Like if it's just me and I get to do what I want, I tend to be more experimental or lazy. I'll do like monochromatic all day long. I'm like, this looks awesome. And then some friend of Tom's who said you should get someone to color that will come along to my desk and be like, that's not done. Some
That's
troll,
not done.
some comics troll telling us what to do.
Comic stroll. Yeah, the lazy anvil we'll call it next time.
The lazy anvil. Yeah, totally.
Um, I want to ask you, I'm just trying to think about some cartoonists who use color in exciting ways that I've noticed, and I can think of three, and I just want to run them by you, and maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, and just get some impressions. Uh, and I'll mention them, and then we can talk about. One is Joan Sfar's book Klezmer. Joan Sfar is a crazy, loosey-goosey, super confident cartoonist who just has such energy and usually doesn't color his own work, but Klezmer he colored, and it's just wild, insanely
Mm.
splotchy watercolor. It's insane, and I want to know what you think. Then I want to bring up Emil Ferris, whose second book I think just came out, but I haven't seen it. But my favorite thing is Monsters. Is like as I understand it, all ballpoint pen, all these Bic colors, and it's a crazy mosaic of colors. And then I usually don't do things like this, but I'm going to mention my wife Leela. We just put out Vic
Yay.
Grade, and it's really phantasmagorical watercolors, and I think she's really done something kind of original with that, or at least original in comics at the moment. And I guess as a runner-up, I could also bring up Brecht. I think that's how you pronounce it,
Correct,
Brecht.
Evan?
Yeah, who uses color in really wonderful ways. And as a runner-up, I'd bring up Tommy Parrish, who I think does marvelous color
Oh
work
my
too.
God, Tom, there's too many
Um,
things.
but so
But a lot
to
of them are watercolor and they're unified by a kind of kaleidoscopic approach to color where they're very vivid, really wild. They tend to notice their power they have with ink, like and they use less white and it's either all color or black. A lot of the stuff that Johann Sfar is doing is just two or three colors if you look at the
uh,
page. Like he'll have a page that's yellow and blue mostly, but bits of green too. So it ends up being three colors, but he's just using two from the palette and doing it really loose and leaving a lot of white of the page. And then
yeah,
another page will be like blue and red and a little bit of purple because he's mixing those together. And then when he's adding what appears to be like a lot of colors, it's just three colors. It's red, yellow, and blue, which is primary, which you have access to a lot of different colors.
I feel like
Yeah.
he's done the Hergé method on
Yeah.
tons of stimulants, you know? So he's just got like he's like
Uh,
yeah, but
Yes,
still going
somewhere
page.
between like Hergé having a studio of 20 people coloring his work and then like 11:59, 2020, at his house with like one nubbin of Crayola left. Yeah, so the speed can affect what your color looks like and how you color it for sure. Leela's stuff is super saturated, similar to Brecht Evans, where but saturated in a juicy way, not saturated in like a muddy, I can't see what's going on way, but just like really vivid. And a lot of that comes from watercolor. You like I feel like a lot of people when we first try watercolor, we use like a lot of water, or we try a wash. Let's say we're like, okay, and then you start to realize, oh my God, I have the power. And then you're like, how dark can I make it? We go the other way, right? So that's the other thing too. It's kind of fascinating about color as a medium or using color in your mediums is how much pigment do I want to leave on the page and how dark will it get or how bright will it get. And those are you'll get lots of different results. But yeah, if you look at if colorists that are like not afraid of anything, they still have some type of um, protocol or recipe I think they're using. I don't know what Leela's recipe is. You'll have to ask her and bring it back to us. Like, Leela, how do I color stuff? But Brecht Evans was like a lot of yellow, which is something people do with watercolor, I've heard, where I've tried it. I don't know if it works really well, but you put a thin layer of yellow and then let that dry and then add color on top of it. It's supposed to make
Hmm.
it more rich. I've tried it and I thought it was fine. But you might have better results. Like it's definitely something people do. And so I feel like Brett Evans might have been doing that because a lot of the stuff I've noticed is bright yellow with sparkling bright disco colors on top of it, but the yellow is coming through instead of the white of the page. It's just like I'll just leave that yellow there unresolved. Sort of like Johann Svar being splotchy in texture.
Unresolved. That's a great phrase because
Yeah, you
that's
don't
what
have
I'm
to
afraid
color
of.
the whole
Right,
thing.
right, right.
That's a power too, like when to not, right? Like it would be weird, another baking analogy, it'd be weird to ice like half of a cake or something like that. But you can decide like, okay, do we just do just a vanilla layer or do you want to add flowers? Maybe it's just a plain cake. That's okay. Glazing, yes, glazing, Martha says the yellow technique. You can use any color for that. A lot of old school, by old school, I mean like Michelangelo era Italian Renaissance painters would use like red or burnt sienna in their background, like grisaille, sort of like first preliminary layer, especially with skin tones, because underneath our skin is tissues that are red, right? So if you have that red underlayer, it kind of made everybody really glowy and fabulous and real looking. Oh
Color.
my Are you exhausted yet?
Um, wow.
We didn't even talk about capitalism. I guess we talked
Oh,
about
oh my
socialism
God.
already.
Holy cow. No,
Uh,
wait, you're totally right. We didn't.
well, I was just more like color is more available than ever, and it used to be that only rich people could distribute art, and now we all get to enjoy it in any color we want.
I,
Um,
I don't think I have
Maybe
anything.
slightly tangentially capitalistic is that when the pulp magazines came out, it was right when the color printing emerged. So
Yeah.
everyone went crazy for the magazine covers. They're like, oh my God, we can do color now. So they would hire illustrators to do a Saturday Evening Post, but also like Shadow Magazine, all the pulp
Yeah.
ones. Like the covers were crazy. They're like acid green
Yeah.
and lots of black and red. But it was so if you're like running to go to work and you walk past the newsstand, you would see all these colorful things and be like, oh my God, I have to buy that just because it was like so cool and looking and good looking. And they also used glossy paper. So it was like 3D HD television
Oh,
compared to like the black and white, newsprint type stuff that you had seen like a few weeks prior. It was like totally mind blowing.
wow.
And they
That's a
wanted some more copies, so color covers.
so lurid covers, vividly painted. Wow.
Contrast also, they used a lot of black. Well, not with the Saturday Evening Post. A lot of times they would use like a lot of negative space, something clever with the background not being there.
Like,
Typography. I have
wow.
such I have like a tiny little dusting of art history knowledge, and I'm sitting here like I'm like a PhD in these things. I'm absolutely not. Like Google any of this, and it may or may not be right, but it's what I remember. I taught a history of illustration class at the School of Visual Arts, um, and it was really fun. I would love to teach that again. But I inherited all my notes from the previous instructor who had several bunny rabbits, so all the notes were chewed through. And I'm fairly sure it was accurate. Like we took the notes, she walked with me. She's such a lovely lady. We walked to the Xerox machine and tried to put them through, and some of them were getting stuck because they were like just beyond. I think her rabbit by that point been long deceased too. So these were old notes. But so anyway, I inherited the knowledge I have. I don't know how accurate it is, but I'm passing my dubious ideas to you, and I hope they help.
Well, they help me, and I'm, as you know, I want to mention stuff since we're winding down, and I think it sounds like we've exhausted the concept of color, at least in the Terrible Anvil kind of way.
We exhausted ourselves.
Yeah. Um, I want to, I want to mention before we find out what the next episode is that we're almost at the end. I think we have two more episodes, maybe three. But also,
Yep.
I feel like this whole 20 episodes that we've done is a baggy first draft of itself. And I'm now starting to see that it's got a through line, at least for me. You might have a different through line, but my through line is that, like, I started out not drawing comics 20 weeks ago. And last week's we were talking about analog versus digital. We were talking about other material. And I've been slowly working on the iPad to get some work done. I'm stating it as a goal now, 18 weeks in, that I know what the podcast is about, at least from a narrative point of view. I'm stating it as a goal that on that last episode, I'm going to have some pages ready that are done. And I won't show them. I mean, I'll show them on, line or something like that. But the point is that, like,
Everyone on the video call, I just see like
uh,
the gay Muppet
so,
arms. They're like
but
really
the,
excited. Yes.
but so that's like that would had I thought of that earlier, it would have been a better thing. So a second draft would be like,
I don't know. Is that
but
better?
Tom is struggling and can't get work done. He needs to talk with Jess Relifson for 20 weeks, or something. Um, but
It's like therapy. It's talk therapy. This is what I think was so funny. It's like we're like, I don't know. Tom has the best ideas, and I'm like, I'm just doing what he says because it's usually fine. But like he's never been like, let's break the law. So like usually pretty good. But we're breaking the art police law, so that feels cool.
totally.
Yeah, like I don't know. I was like I didn't really go into it with any like preconceived ideas other than like this could be really fun because we always have a lot of fun on video calls. Um, but it is funny to take stock of things like taking stock of our episodes to date, but I'm laughing because I'm thinking about taking stock of all this old art I made where I'm like, oh my God, I made that. Tom described his experience saying like, wow, like finding an old sketchbook with treasures in it. I was more like, ha, like uncovering skeletons. I was like, oh man, I did a lot of work, and I maybe I'm just a pessimist, but after sorting through all that stuff, I was like, it makes sense that I could only make the work I'm making today because I made a ton of nonsense, and some of it was good, and some of it was maybe not that good. But this was the best of the best stuff that I had preserved, and I would say I easily threw away half of it. I'm not someone who says you should throw away your art, but I'm renting and I don't have the space, so I had to again do the Noah's Ark of just two of everything. And it's fine, but it's really weird to have that much space between what you're making and then what you think about it. So it's really cool to like take a look back and be like, oh wow, maybe this means something different than I think it does. And it changes the longer that space is between making it and saying something about it. So we're at like episode 18 of 20. And we're like, oh, this is pretty good. This is better than I thought. Thank God. And maybe in a year we'll be like, oh, well, like if we have to write an artist grant proposal, we'll be like, well, we made a podcast about these specific things, and we clearly meant to do that on
Right.
the entire time we were doing it. So that's what's really exciting and also unnerving about like when artists come to the Friday night workshop talks is they'll be like, this is my work to date. And we're like, oh my God, they're so amazing. And not that they're not amazing, but it's so easy to tie a narrative around something that's been cooking a while, or you're like, oh, this makes sense. But when we're making this stuff, when you're in the trenches and the anvil is ahead of you, you're like, I don't know what any of this means or what it's doing. And knowing what it is or what you're doing is sort of overrated until it's behind you. And then you can kind of figure out what you want to do next. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
Totally, totally. And give yourself the gift of making more work and throwing it in a closet that you can
Yeah.
find later, because it is a gift, and it gives you context, it gives you experience, it gives you narrative continuity in your own life, your own artistic life. You can see, oh, that's who I was, and that's how I got to where I am now, whatever that is. Um,
Yeah. It was so funny asking the same question in a different tone of that same stack of old drawings. Like, what is this for in a creative curiosity way? Like, oh, it made me who I am. Here's our bit on capitalism. Asking
oh,
it from a capitalist perspective, what is this for? I was like, oh my God, why did I do all this? I made so much stuff, and like, I don't know if it launched me into the stardom I was really dreaming of. I mean, I don't even know if that was necessarily a goal, but it was so striking to be like, what the hell did I do all this for? Because it had been hiding out at my sister's house in a time capsule. So yeah, like what Tom says, putting it away and then not thinking about it and then coming back to it when you almost don't recognize it. It's like running into someone on the street you haven't seen in so long you barely recognize them and you're like, whoa, man. It's cool, but it's freaky, man.
Um, yeah. And anyway, yeah, that's that's all good. Our whole lives are baggy first drafts.
So knowing what you know now about the podcast, like, do you think we should have a do-over or a sequel, like a second season where we approach it completely differently with like a proposal in mind?
Yeah, we redo every episode with
Oh my God, we should have. I haven't. We only have a couple episodes left. We're going to talk about dialogue and scripting and writing next week, and then the last one is going to be
all the piano.
sell the piano, how to make art for the rest of your life, um, something like that, like how to do it without not doing it and also not feeling bad. It's sort of a full circle, hopefully. But it would be great to have like an episode. We sort of talked about starting over, but I like the idea of a do-over. And I have a lot of friends that are obsessive, namely my husband will rewrite the hell out of something. I'm like, it's fine. I'm such a, maybe I'm just really lazy, but I'm like, that's fine. Just leave it. Just keep going. Like I think you should go to the end of the draft before you edit it. And he will just polish these things
Oh,
until he likes them. But I will say his work is remarkable and some of mine isn't. So I'm like, maybe you can spud to something. Like he's definitely going for quality over quantity. Yeah, so maybe that's what I learned going through a giant stack of drawings. Is like, I'm gonna make less things that are better so that it's less for me to move and less for
really? Is that the decision you made? I mean, is
I
that
don't know
what?
if I made any decisions. I was more like I miss painting and I want to make bright colored stuff and I want to make happy stuff and weird stuff. And I made a note to myself. I have a comic idea for some kind of autobiographical stuff with my husband. And my only note was make it as unmarketable as possible.
Yeah.
And like don't show anyone. Like just do the opposite of what I've been doing, where I'm like trying to make my mark in the world. I'm like, nope, this is just gonna be weird shit that no one gets to see.
Okay. We have so much potential for another 20 episodes.
Yay.
Secret episodes. Maybe we'll just make 20 secret episodes.
We'll just yeah, oh yeah, or the next two episodes will be 10 hours long each, and then we'll fit it all in there. Totally fine.
Oh, interesting. All right. So next episode is about dialogue.
Yes, chit
Cool.
chat, but also like words on the page. How many words do you want on your page? How do you write stuff? How do you script stuff? So it's a little bit about pacing too. But yeah, writing and in any genre. Like how do you write a comic? How do you edit a script? How do you get a script draft? Yeah, and this might be a sort of crossover with the collaborative thing. One thing I was thinking about color, if you collaborate with a colorist, you can give them notes. But I'm laughing because Tom and I worked on the Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan, and there was a colorist, really lovely. I think Sally was a student at SAW and went on to make a bunch of really cool
Ellie did the
comics.
military parts, and this guy Mike did the adventure parts. Yeah.
Yeah, so like we had a couple notes for Sally, but I get my drawing wasn't super specific. So what was interesting to me when I got the color pages back is all the brown people were white and all the white people were brown, and it really freaked me out. I was like, oh my God, and I was like, well, that's kind of it was really interesting, but it was also like it doesn't matter, but for character's sake, I need to tell you like who's who because that's what the drawing was supposed to look like. But it was really cool to see someone else like have a completely different set of parameters than I would have in approaching the color. So that's something you can practice color is like trade a page with a friend and be like, can you color this and I'll color yours? And you can like learn just by watching someone else make decisions. Kind
It's
of
a
cool.
great idea.
Yeah.
Collaboration could have been in the collaboration episode too, but that's a great
Collaboration
idea.
color comics.
All right, Jess, thank you. It's been another amazing anvil, another amazing terrible anvil. Um, I guess I'll see you in a week. We will talk about dialogue.
Yes. Let's dialogue about some dialogue and writing and scripting.
How will baking and capitalism come into next episode?
Well, tune in next week and maybe cats. We didn't really mention cats. Shout out on the mic to cats.
Oh, cats. All right, Jess. Thanks everybody in the chat,
Thank
and thanks
y'all.
everybody. Slow it saw everybody. We'll see you all over the place.
Bye.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks, Meg, for typing, and I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. This has been a production of the Sequential Artists Workshop, or SAW. You can find us on social media at Comics Workshop and online at sawcomics.org. You can hear about our many courses at learn.sawcomics.org. SAW is a nonprofit and supported by people like you. Learn how to make a tax-deductible donation at the donate page of sawcomics.org.
You can join our free community of comics explorers at members.sawcomics.org. Thanks so much for being here.